The attempt to align architecture with science and technology, which began with Lozier and culminated in the international style in the 20th century, was motivated by the desire to infuse architecture with some kind of a measurability, rationality, and universality. The belief that reason is the only universal attribute of mankind was taken to imply that only a universal visual language can express universal modernity. To look for rationality in the visual language and consequently in the composition of the objective body, that is the building, its materiality, was, I believe, an error, an epistemological error. It diverted the architectural knowledge from the true medium of architecture, which is space. It is true that we encounter architecture initially through a visual impression of its visible body, its material presence. That may be the reason all our discourses on architecture, such as the triad of Vitruvius, the beauty, stability, and functionality, or the duality of Alberti, that is design and matter, were limited to the concern for the materiality and appearance of the architectural object only. The program of accommodations, either it's a house, a church, temple, or a mosque, a school, or a corporate office, workplace, this program, which initiated the birth of architecture, is indeed important. This, together with its location, give some kind of a uniqueness and a specificity to a work. However, this recede in the background over a period of time, and it is the architectonic qualities which are generally foregrounded and talked about in critical discourses. In fact, until the turn of the last century, it was the iconography, the object itself, the corporeality, which dominated the architectural discourses. That changed with the publication of an insightful book by a German art historian, Paul Frankel, in 1914. Prior to that, space has already found mention in the works of some art historians in Europe. But by and large, they ended up drawing attention to pictorial space of the painting, made possible by the invention of perspective. Like the difference you see in this painting, Buonanzena in 14th century, prior to the invention of perspective, you see the space in which the young Christ is engaged in a discourse with his disciples. The space is flat, like almost like a background curtain. It's not even in the perspective. While in this case, this painting by Raphael, the School of Athens, you see the space itself becomes the important element of the painting. Architectural space also was investigated by August Choisy through his iconic graphic representations. Very innovative, like this drawing of Pantheon or Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, where he places the observer into the space. You're looking into the space of the building from below, like a worm's eye view, unlike a bird's eye view, which was the standard practice those days, where you're always outside. So the space was more or less there in the consciousness of the artists and architects, but it was the systematic investigation of space by Paul Frankel as a distinct spatial form in architecture that deserves more attention. In this book, Frankel constructed a critical narrative to explain architecture through 4 analytical categories. He called them: 1, corporeal form, that is dealing with the treatment of mass, surface, and iconography in the buildings. Second category was the visible form, dealing with the treatment of light, color, and the general optical effects, the way we perceive a building. It has to do with the way observer and the building relate with each other. Third category was the purposive form, the purpose of the building, that is dealing with the connection between the design and the programmatic demands, its functionality, in other words. And finally, the fourth category was the spatial form, dealing with the order of spatial arrangement within the building. A very significant fact about this book is that these categories of Frankel is a significant departure and much overdue departure from the conventional analysis of architecture, which was in vogue in those days, and that is by the Vitruvian triad of Formitas, Commoditas, and Venustas, or not very often, but still through Alberti's dual categories of design and matter. While the first 3 categories, that is the corporeal, visible, and the purposive forms, more or less matched Vitruvian formula, the fourth category of Frankel, the category of spatial form, was a significant new addition. Neither Vitruvius nor Alberti talked about space. This departure from the earlier orthodoxy immediately locates architecture or architectural criticism and theory within the 20th century and aligns it with the new emerging scientific worldview. But, and this is an important but, on its own term, it aligns architecture with the demands of being scientific or being rational now on its own terms, on architectural terms, and not that of science and technology. For spatial analysis in architecture has all the attributes of abstraction, logic, and in general rationality, as I intend to demonstrate here today. Spatial form is a universal tool which transcends the temporal and civilizational variations and differentiations in architecture. Each culture, civilization, and geographical locations has developed its own formal language, iconography, and symbolism. So is the case with the visual perception and social order. These have always been talked about and covered in the earlier discourses. Vitruvius's triad was sufficient enough for that. Space, on the other hand, to the extent that it can be sensed but becomes comprehensible only via the abstract representation of plan and section, is therefore the intellectual and rational category. I'm convinced that Frankel intended to look for a new analytical tool to understand and explain new architecture in the era increasingly being dominated by a call for rationality in every spheres of life. Frankel relied heavily on abstracted and simplified plans of both religious and secular architecture of Renaissance and Baroque. Even though his immediate focus was limited to these 2 periods in history, I believe the analytical tool that he established, found out, is applicable to all periods of history. Through the analysis of these plans, Frankel intended to establish that though architecture communicates with us initially through the visual and corporeal forms, that is what we see, what we do not see or can see only through the mind's eye is that there is an inner logic, another level of order, spatial order, which is abstract and is visible and is available to us only through a study and analysis of the plans. I have taken a few plans from Frankel's book and presented here besides images of actual spaces that they represent. And the results are quite revealing. The Arezzo Ronzetti in Italy shows that every space is either a multiple of or a division of a single volume. I guess that a similar relation also must exist in section. The plan of Sobond Church in Paris demonstrates the clever resolution of the duality of two entrances and two altars. The primacy of the long axis points towards the tomb of the cardinal who sponsored this church and is reinforced by the directionality of the four lateral chapels occupying the four corners. The regular plan, though beautifully rendered, does not reveal this symbolism. The dome of Borromini's St. Ivo Church in Rome has a complex geometry with intersections of triangles, circles, and rigorous dimensioning consistency, which would not be easily comprehended without the plan form. And finally, at the staircase hall of the Bruxelles Castle in Germany, the simple plan does not tell the story that behind this highly sensuous Baroque space, there is a rigorous structural order, and a complex geometry has been employed to resolve the structure in a way that would make Luigi Nervi proud. You cannot comprehend this Baroque space until you represent it in a way that appeals to the mind. All these examples show the application of a rigorous and rational mind. Even though this approach is independent of our immediate sensorial perception and phenomenal experiences of architecture, it is no less significant. Plan section take us to the non-experiential, that is, logical and rational aspects of architecture. For the physicality of architecture, the built form, what you see, and the formal cause, what is the idea behind it, or idea that is embodied in that form, constitutes the essential duality of architecture. One cannot be seen without the other. They are independent but interdependent. One comes to us through our retinal organ, the eye, and our bodily presence, while the other is offered to us through the mind's eye, endowed with imagination and reason. But for spatial form to be really meaningful, the term plan cannot be confined to mean only the horizontally cut view of the floor. It must also include the vertically cut view, commonly known as section. Both these forms of representation are planar, refer to spatial aspects of architecture, are equally abstract and converse with us, that talk to us, not through the sensual perceptual experience, but through the cerebral reason. Thus, when I refer to plan, it also implies section, the vertical plan. It is the plan form in sectional representation. Still, it will be wrong to assume that architects were not conscious of space before 20th century. But it was the introduction of spatial form as a tool and rigorous analysis of many Renaissance and Baroque plans by Paul Frankel that made us aware that space must have always been at the back of the mind of architects throughout history. And that is because of a peculiar nature of the spatial order. It is abstract, and for it to be comprehensible, it must first be represented in sensible form, that is, through graphical representation as a plan. The present two-dimensional orthogonal drawings, plan section elevations, that architects use today and take for granted that architects must have used it throughout history, constitutes a language of signs and symbols, a system of notations similar to the musical notations of the Western music, a 5-line staff with notes placed to indicate pitch and duration. This system of notation of the spatial order in architecture is a relatively recent phenomenon. Its exact origin is not known, but the earliest attempt I could find is an elevation drawn in watercolor of the Strasbourg church dating back roughly to 13th century in France. Before this, there is one record in the form of Mason's notebook showing wooden templates used to shape the profile of columns. Making two-dimensional drawing seems to have fully developed only during Renaissance. Its original purpose was to convey the architect's design intentions to builders and craftsmen to faithfully execute the work, just as the musical score does to convey the composer's intentions to the players and conductors. What is common for both the system of notations in music and in architecture is that both are tools of transmitting the essential information about the work of an art for others to faithfully execute. For this, the work has to undergo an intellectual filtration and be abstracted from its sensuous and experiential context and rendered in a language of signs and symbols which are universally intelligible. It is a tool for communication. As such, its success depends on universally understood convention. It must mean the same thing for observer as it means for the architect and the composer. But we need to make a crucial distinction here between a plan and a plan form. A plan in terms of architectural graphics normally signifies a two-dimensional planar representation of a three-dimensional object, a building. Thus, any building can be represented as a plan. But there is a difference between architecture and building, as we saw earlier. One is an idea which, when embodied in the physicality of the building, becomes comprehensible to us as an architectural object. And that idea has its own intrinsic order, a thoughtful arrangement of parts, which distinguishes it as the world within the world. The adjective thoughtful is essential, as not any arrangements will do. It refers either to a well-considered interpretation of the institution the building is housing, and not just a literal diagrammatic transformation of a functional program, or it could be the subconscious reflection of the worldview. In any case, it is the bedrock on which the order of the building is built. This order is expressed through geometry most often, but it does not always have to be. When a plan displays this order, I refer to it as plan form. Form refers to the non-physical and logical relationship between parts. This is the rationality of architecture. Plan form then contains a hint of a possible path towards understanding the universal aspiration of modernity in architecture without having to borrow the rationality and methods of science. It offers the possibility of endowing the architectural object with both the experiential qualities, which we experience through our perception, emotional qualities through cultural memories, iconography and symbols, as well as with reason through the logic of the plan. I want to demonstrate this by looking at plans of 4 buildings. 2 of these are university campuses, large. One, the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson, and the Free University of Berlin. Both of these universities built in different geographical, cultural, and temporal context. The third example, compared to these large university campuses, is a very tiny space used just to house a stair. But it's very interesting. And the fourth is a residence in India. The University of Virginia, conceived in 1819, presents a classical Greco-Roman axial design. The north-south axis, highlighting the rotunda on the northern edge, is modulated and layered by 4 transverse paths in the east-west direction. The plan form is informed by the specific social relations between various components of the institutions. Departing from the prevalent norms, higher education here was separated from any religious doctrine. Under normal circumstances, where there would be a church, every university used to have a church prominently placed in the campus. This campus at Charlottesville is planned and centered around a library housed in the rotunda. Thus, the library, repository of knowledge, replaces religious orthodoxy. Other existing American universities were closely tied to religious institutions. Since the main purpose of higher education was at that time the instruction of church clergymen, Jefferson believed instead that the primary focus of the curriculum should be scientific knowledge. Keeping with Jefferson's views that religious instruction be kept separate from the university studies, he included neither church nor chapel in his design. This in itself was revolutionary because libraries were not important features of other institutions where learning was based on students' recitation of texts memorized from professors' lectures. The campus plan is improvised and adapted to a conception of the university as an academic village. That is the idea. With its 10 independent schools, each housed in a clearly identifiable buildings facing the central terraced lawn. So here was the idea, the academic village, and the plan and the resultant architecture became the embodiment of that plan, the idea. With this new arrangement, it is essentially a geometric plan form with the axial symmetry as a powerful symbol of the centrality of secular knowledge. The residences of the students are set back from the 2 academic arms and have their own open but less formal spaces. The plan form then reveals to us the idea of the university Thomas Jefferson had. Its formal cause. It was that a university is a secular place of learning, where students will seek knowledge by their own initiative and not be taught by rote learning. While each discipline is independent, there is no hierarchy. All streams of knowledge are equally important. The centrality of law then holds all together and is the symbol of the institute and embodies this idea. In contrast, the Free University of Berlin, conceived in 1963 by architects Candelis, Josek, and Shadrach Woods, is a three-dimensional matrix-like grid of streets, squares, courtyards, and walkways. Unlike Jefferson's University, which was conceived as an academic village, the idea behind this was the university as a city. Also, while the central lawn symbolizes the institution in the earlier case, the three-dimensional grid symbolizing interconnection between various elements provide the identity to the whole campus at Berlin. Disciplines and knowledge streams like medicine, philosophy, law, mathematics, etc., are not individually articulated, but facilitated to communicate horizontally with each other. This stems from a radical rethinking of the educational system, wherein new ideas are generated at the overlap of disciplines and where boundaries are blurred. A modular system of built units provide classrooms, seminars, laboratories, lecture theaters, etc., spread out all over the campus and without any hierarchical organization or tied specifically to a faculty or a department. Departmental identities are nebulous, functional, and not physical. A non-directional grid symbolizing connections and movement is the appropriate form. It has integrity and internal logic. Shadrach Wood, who is largely credited with the design, his plan for the Free University of Berlin was organized in a matte plan arrangement, like a three-dimensional interwoven fabric. A matte building is a large-scale, high-density structure organized on the basis of modulated grid. In the Free University, a seemingly regular grid gives general order to the ground plan. However, further analysis of the building in section reveal a more complex layering and shifting of this grid to create the intended conditions of interrelatedness between the learning areas of the university. The implementation of the matte building organization actually dismantled the compositional principles of the early modern period through the use of newly developed architectural language. The built form of both these campuses and their materiality immediately locate each in their own respective geographical and cultural milieu. University of Virginia in the colonial United States and the Free University of Berlin with its prefabricated modular and Cortan steel external finish in the mid-20th century Europe. They are both specific to their respective domains in that respect. But to the extent that both plan forms are rigorously rational representation of the idea of university, have organizational integrity and logic, they are both universal, rational, and thus domain-free and transcendental. In fact, both are ideational and tectonic interventions. To be modern, that that is to be contemporaneous with the time we live in, is intrinsic to the human nature. Everyone, every society wants to be modern in that respect. What constitutes modernity and its expression in art and architecture may differ and may depend upon the contemporary material and intellectual culture of that society at any given time. Thus, to aspire to a universal modernity, as was implied by the declaration End of History by Francis Fukuyama in the 1980s, was, I think, a mistake. Equally erroneous was the call for the international style in architecture, implying that the visual language evolved by aligning architecture with science and technology was the highest form of rationality and modernity, and therefore that was the architectural language for all societies and across all cultures. Kamla House is a small house which the Indian architect Balakrishna Doshi built for himself and his family in 1961 in Ahmedabad, Western India. The house has been expanded with additions on 3 corners. But the original plan is a biaxial square with 4 columns in the center. On the face of it, it looks like a simple, straightforward plan and an efficient and reasonable transformation of the family's needs and the program. However, there is more to the plan than is initially obvious. The dimensions of the larger square, A, and that of the square made by the 4 columns, B, set up a biaxial grid, A, B, A, in both north-south as well as east-west directions. This is a plan form most associated with Andrea Palladio, the Venetian architect of the Renaissance. Symmetry, mathematical ratio, spatial complexity, and overall intellectual rigor underlay the Palladian plan. The most famous example of which is the Villa Rotunda in Vicenza. Now, I'm sure Doshi was neither conscious of this reference, nor was he deliberately following an historical precedent. In fact, as one of his early sketches show, he seems to have begun with a reference to his mentor, Le Corbusier, and his plans of parallel walls, and went on to a square geometry. This is how Doshi describes the evolution of the plan by himself. 2 hours later, on the drafting table, I had a plan ready. 4 columns in the center. On the left, a kitchen, and on the right, a staircase. A square divided into 4 parts, automatically creating a cross. The entrance attached to the dining and living area, and a bathroom at the other end, sandwiched between 2 bedrooms. But this seemingly simple and obvious discipline does link this plan with the long line of history that go far back as the classical Greek and Roman antiquity. This very fact of its being connected with the past through its rationality, and that both Palladio in European Renaissance, in Doshi in the 20th century India, and yet this rationality remains independent of history in the sense that Doshi has not arrived at it this by consciously referencing this to the famous historical precedent, lends it an aura of universality and places the plan form at an abstract plane, liberating it from the domain specificity of here and now. But at the corporeal level, the level of here and now, Doshi's sketches and completed house show imaginative innovations in elements that protect the house from radiant heat and rain of Western India without sentimental imitation of traditional ways. And in the process, obtaining soft, diffuse, reflected light inside. The use of exposed concrete, brick, and black stone flooring lend this house a sense of newness. But this newness is coupled with cultural rootedness and familiarity. Palladian geometry, the underlying structure of the plan, is progressively concealed under several layers of experiences that include varying intensities of light, some coming in directly from openings, but mostly bouncing off various surfaces. This light creates spatial differentiations independent of geometry and placement of walls and other objects in space. Thus, unlike the Venetian Villa of Palladio, this building, while addressing the universal rationality of geometry through its plan form, transcends that geometry to remain rooted in the existential reality of the city in the 20th century. It is both rational and modern at the same time. And finally, we come to the small space designed specifically to accommodate a staircase. In this case, the staircase, which is part of a larger complex designed by Frank Furness, the 19th century American architect. Like the stair hall at the Bruxelles Castle in Germany we saw earlier, this is also a part of a larger building, the library of the University of Pennsylvania. However, the space that houses the stair in this case is an independent space with its own architectural character, while still well integrated with the rest of the building. The view of the building from the front greens also suggests that Furness intended this as a prominent element in his overall architectural composition. In the plan also, the stair hall is located right next to the entrance porch, outside and independent of the main library functions. Interestingly, this stair also serves the larger public functions, independent of the library. It takes you to the Archaeological Museum on the second floor and the auditorium on the third floor above the reading room. Though neither of these public functions ever occupied this building, as the university managed to find much larger facilities for them. However, this dichotomy, that is being part of library and yet independent of them, does give credence to the argument that while this is indeed a part of a larger entity, it has its own unique order. This all makes it interesting to investigate the order of this element as a singular, complete world within the world. The hall itself is about 6.5 meters square tower, and its outer walls are made of red sandstone, brick, and terracotta. The stair itself is constructed from cast iron and steel, beautifully detailed, and presents immediate contrast with the solid stone and brick enclosure. This contrasting relationship between the delicate iron stair and the masculine stone and brick envelope with large openings is pervasive, and one cannot help wonder if Furness purposely intended to highlight the independence of both, and thus setting apart the design of the stair itself. Because it is in this design of the stair that the ingenuity of Frank Furness comes across. The hall is divided into 3 bays in the north-south axis. The stair begins its climb upward in a grand and formal manner from the central bay. This has all the markers of a grand ceremonial beginning, with promise to take you to equally important public places at the end, that is the museum and the auditorium. The entrance to the reading hall of the library is right in front of you, and you do not need the stair to approach it. This duality of library and the other public functions, museum and the auditorium, is immediately apparent at the entrance hall once you are in front of the stair. Still, the formality and the exuberant detailing does prepare you for the magnificent space of the reading room that lies ahead. Furness does away with the formality soon from the very first landing onward. The centrality of the stair gives way to asymmetry from the first landing itself. While the stair continues its journey upward, occupying the central and the left bays, the right of the eastern bay becomes a passage to what was supposed to be the museum on the second floor. The landing on the third floor is large enough to be a place on its own right, a foyer, and leads to a large, well-lit space, which would have been the auditorium over the reading room. Louis Kahn, when he was teaching here, conducted his master's studio in this space and insisted on doing this here only. And this is also where I spent a year as his student, going up and down the stair every day and often several times a day. The stair continues, but now it is narrower, occupying only the single bay on the east, on the right, and also becomes lighter and more playful as it reaches the top. While the stair undergoes all these variations, two things hold the whole together and constitutes the architectural order of the space. These are, one, the consistency and the presence of the stone and brick enclosure. And the second is the geometry. While the visual strength of the outer enclosure, the solidity and the reliability of its being there, provides the crucial element of constancy, letting the designer enjoy the freedom to make the desired variations in the design of the stair itself, so long as he remains within the discipline brought in by the geometry, which is evident only when you see it in the plan form. What is also fascinating about the space is that, unlike in the classical stair halls, where one is always on a single floor at any given time, at least visually cut off from other floors, leaving behind the one you have come from, and the one you are going to is not yet visible. Here in this case, one is always visually connected with the place you have come from and also where you are going. It adds a temporal dimension to this place. Past, present, and future are all compressed in this one space and in this one moment. One is reminded of the famous opening lines of T.S. Eliot in Burnt Norton. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Furness was known as a maverick architect. His architecture follows none of the 19th century conventions of classical order. he asserted through his architecture the emerging American individualism. And he has left us with a fascinating space. And it is a fascinating space because in this, the corporeal, the visual, the purposive, and the spatial forms of Paul Frankel are all brought together in single order. All these four designs we saw, of the two universities and the stair hall and the house residence, demonstrate this point. Both Thomas Jefferson as well as Shadrach Wood and his team who designed the Berlin Free University were equally rational, and this is evident in the respective plan form of the two universities. They both were modern in their own time, though 150 years apart. They both broke new grounds and innovated to be contemporaneous with the values of their own time. Same can be said about Doshi and Frank Furness. If René Descartes' dictum, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, is to mean anything, it is that rationality is not only a universal attribute of mankind, but also eternal and not a temporal attributes tied up with human evolution. Every human being is a rational being at all times and in all across geography. This becomes evident in the way architecture is conceived and organized in plan form. Whether it is through an archetype, divine model, or otherwise, or by individual initiative, it is a rational exercise, and that rationality is expressed in the plan form.